Good morning to you all. There's an Hungarian saying I learned yesterday for people like me who open events like this, and it goes like this. It's not in Hungarian. You just need to be there. That I did. To be pretty, it's much too early for that, and to offer a warm welcome. And that I do with a lot of pleasure. So here we go. Welcome to everyone. This is an event that will address higher education in Europe, which for the most of us is the world that we work in, that we dedicate ourselves to. And today, unlike all the other days, at least speaking for myself, we engage in discussions about higher education all the time without knowing much about it, yet, claiming to be knowledgeable about it. Well, today we'll discuss it with real experts. People who are here behind the table or here in the hall and who can say a few sensible things about this. And I look forward to that. I want to pass on particular thank you to this lady here who, well, barely sits behind the table and is, in my eyes, the most important person here. Not only has she dedicated her work for years to this topic, she is also the organizer of this event. And this event will be starting with people from the Center for Global Higher Education at the University of Oxford, for which Aniko has been a member for long. And they have produced a book that, according to experts, is a major contribution to the knowledge on higher education governance in Europe. Aniko is also a member now of the Department of Organization Science, and we have a few experts in the field, but we're very eager to also reach out to other experts and to organize this event. I will hand over to Simon Marginson now. He's a professor of higher education at the University of Oxford, also the director of the center, and a fellow at the Academy of Social Sciences, which I understood is like the wisest of the wisest in the UK. I wish you lots of joy and inspiration.
Thank you for that gracious introduction. That's very nice, and it's good to be here. Let me welcome the online audience also and assure everyone, both online and in physical presence, that this seminar will be used in its online format for years to come. And we're finding with our Centre for Global Higher Education events that the take-up of the YouTube videos is considerably greater than the attendance online or the attendance face-to-face. So there's really three dimensions, to these events now, not just one, and that ongoing role of the discussion will be drawn on by people all over the world. And I think it's appropriate that it should be, because this is an important book in a field which has, I wouldn't say overcrowded with good books on governance of higher education, but it has had significant contributions over the years. This is one of the most important, surely. I should wave around my copy, as Mike said, show it off. The governance project it has been the most successful of the 15 we began with at the Centre for Global Higher Education and the 10 which we're currently running. And I would say it's the only one which has finished its work more or less about 6 months before the end of the centre. So everyone else is now furiously getting their academic outputs and their impact and so on in place in the last 6 months. But Mike and Aniko, Jürgen, and also Ellen Hazelcorn, who's involved in the project as well, have largely completed their work. 3 magisterial volumes defining where we're at, not only with governance, but all the issues related to governance, system organisation, internal management and financing, and if you like, the temper of the times in higher education institutions. Primarily and first in the UK, with a comparison of the 4 countries in the first book, And in the third book, a study which takes us to the regional level and essentially argues, most important for us in the UK, we need to decentralise higher education. We need to move away from an ultra-centralised Westminster system that operates in the UK. But the middle book is the one which is the comparative book, and that's the one we're talking about today. And I think I might say something about the importance of comparative study. I think higher education is now centrally important, and I mean, that's something which we all, I suppose, luxuriate in, you know, in higher education, but also it sometimes makes us a little uneasy because we cease to control the direction of travel in many respects. Higher education is also becoming, compared to other modern organisations in government and corporations and elsewhere, non-government organisations as well, somewhat less distinctive. Its cultures are, its history, its layered history are part of its evolution going forward, but other factors from outside itself are playing a larger role. And so its governance, which used to only interest us, has now also of interest to more than us, and especially, of course, not only one part of government, but the whole of government. And in that context, it becomes very valuable, I think, to look comparatively, as it always is, but it also becomes valuable because government and the state also differ. I guess what we're now seeing is a situation where the three major traditions which are identified in this book, the Bonapartist Southern Europe tradition, the Humboldtian, and the Anglophone, are increasingly being impacted by forces, by ideas, by modes of organisation, by political cultures from outside higher education, but they're being impacted in varying ways. And one of the things that I like about the book is that it shows us how robust and important the Humboldtian tradition is, and that's still maybe the moral centre of the university worldwide, and that's been more resilient perhaps in some respects than the Bonapartist or the Anglophone traditions have been. But I think increasingly you can explain the variations and the evolution of all three models in terms of differences and variations in the state. So that with in the different countries that are fundamentally shaped in higher education by the Humboldtian tradition, we see variations now, and the book shows us very clearly how Germany, Nordic countries and others differ, and they differ because the state differs from case to case. In the parallel project on the public good role of higher education, where we've hit on this as the central theme, that we're looking comparatively across the world. We're looking at 11 countries and how they handle the notion of the external or public or social role of the institutions. And we're finding that we can divide up the world essentially according to differences in state culture, the relationship between the state and higher education, political culture more generally. And I think that shows itself repeatedly here in this book. It's the state that's really the big player that comes through again and again here. So I commend the work of my colleagues. I think this is a really good and important book. All three books in the governance project have been written so very, very well, so well edited, competently argued, in a sort of middle register which allows any intelligent person to understand what's being said and takes them into the world of higher education successfully. So at this point, let me hand over to my colleagues to present their ideas. Speaking order I suggest we follow is the one which is on the spine of the book, which would mean Michael Shaddock will begin, Anniko Horvath will follow, and Jürgen Enders will round up. And I understand you've got a common presentation, and you'll speak to that, and we'll have time for questions and discussion. We expect the presentation part will go over just over half the time that's left, and then the remaining time we'll have for Q&A. I understand we can bring in our online audience to ask questions. So online audience, begin to think about what you might want to ask. And are we going to require that people write it down, or are we going to have another way of talking to them? Yeah, it looks like we'll be able to talk to you directly. So when we get to the Q&A part, which I'll chair, we'll be able to bring you in directly as we do with webinars. Okay, that should work. Michael Shaddock. Mike is Our doyen of higher education studies in the UK, his books on management and system organisation and the history of higher education since World War II are the spine of the field. I mean, I say that with due regard to the important work of Malcolm Tite and Ron Barnett and others. But Mike's work really is at the centre of things, and he continues on, and we greatly value that. And his energy and his enthusiasm have been key, of course, to this project. He's a pleasure to work with, and we all greatly respect the way he operates and what he's done and what he's doing. But let me say that he was the registrar at Warwick in a very important role, which shaped Warwick in many respects, and also shaped the British higher education system. We see the influence of Mike's Warwick era proteges all over the country still. Then Mike went to the Institute of Education and led the higher education management program and continued to write. And for 8 years now, he's been heading up this project on the governance of higher education in the Centre for Global Higher Education. So, Mike.
Well, thank you, Simon, for the introduction. But let me start by thanking our hosts, Free University of Amsterdam, for putting on the book launch. We've called it a policy forum because we want to emphasize the opportunity for debate. And I should emphasize that we see the book as only the starting point of our discussions today. I'd like to say something about how we hope to structure this first session. I will speak first just to introduce our research and the research methods we employed. Annika will then speak, and then followed by Jürgen, the three authors of the book. Briefly, how we approach the research and the methods adopted. The first product of the CIGI governance group was a book by Annika and myself, The Governance of British Higher Education, The Impact of Governmental, Financial and Market Pressures, published by Bloomsbury in 2020. We based the book on 95 extended in-person interviews in 13 different universities and with policymakers in England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. The universities were carefully chosen to give a broad representative picture of the different types of universities in the UK, as well as their different regional locations. It was always the plan that the scope of the research should be extended to cover continental Europe. Clearly, to do so was an ambitious undertaking, bearing in mind the size and complexity of the national systems involved. We selected 4 countries for research in depth: Germany, Hungary, Norway, and Portugal, representing mid, northern, and southern Europe. 88 in-person interviews in all. And we added the results of our UK study, but treated England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland as separate devolved nations. We also took expert advice from authorities in France and Italy to broaden our understanding of the European scene. In each of our 4 specially selected countries, we chose one research university and one that was more teaching orientated, as well as interviewing policymakers in each national system. We used the same template of questions as for the earlier UK exercise to ensure comparability. Of course, this can't rank as comprehensive for an EU of 27 countries, but we hope our selection gives us some grounds for generalization. A question you might ask, particularly to me, I suppose, is why in a European project we included the UK. Our answer would be that we interpreted Europe broadly. The UK has always been intellectually part of the European scene. The British Library holds correspondence on matters of learning between centres in the UK and the rest of Europe from the 8th century. The UK was a key signatory of the Bologna Agreement and the later creation of the European higher education area. Yes, there's been a political and economic rupture, but our cultures, we believe, remain closely entwined. Let me now turn to Anniko, who will be our next speaker. Anniko.
Just picking up on how Mike finished, I think that one thing that we need to emphasize at the very beginning, that reductionism to some degree was unavoidable when we dealt with the kind of data sets that we were working. And I'm pretty sure that many of the readers would feel that especially from one or the other country where we did the research, that a lot of context and nuance is missing from the data that we presented, and the picture is incomplete. And I think that that's rightly so, probably. But we also try to tell ourselves that the kind of comparisons that we try to make did make the effort worth it, and it's really something coming out of it that is more than the parts only. It's also important to emphasize that when we did the research and the interviews, it was 4 years ago we finished the interviewing session 1 year after that. So it's been since then 3 years with a pandemic and other major developments. So I'm pretty sure that the reason that we have a policy forum here and picking on the topics that are in the book, but not necessarily reflecting just on the book, makes it more relevant to what's happening today. In terms of the topics that I want to touch on briefly, one of them is just the strengthening role of the state and the changing involvement in the higher education issues. Then I want to talk very briefly about students and their role in university governance, and also briefly about the academics' role in university governance. In terms of system management issues, I think that there are two things that need to emphasize. That our findings show it clearly that tradition is very important, and it frames many of the major developments in higher education. And despite the whole European area, national matters still quite often decide on what kind of frameworks we have in higher education. But there are still trends that actually are common throughout these systems. So, for example, the growth in student numbers and also the state budgetary restrictions, or sometimes when the economy goes better, the state spending on higher education and how we channel that kind of higher education spending are roughly common across the whole area. And this, of course, leads to issues that are important at system level. So, for example, the system enlargement and rationalization usually invites state intervention and attempts to increase state control over systems, which means several things. For example, changing funding mechanism, introducing more business-like models in management of the universities, quite often introducing external lay membership or strengthening the role of the lay members on boards. And we've seen that happening, for example, while we were doing the research in Hungary. They just started introducing that system, and then they completely turned it over after we finished the research, and we had to go back and have a second round of interviews because of the changes that were happening there. Just before we published the book, basically. It's also changing systems of imposing accreditation for universities and all kind of quality assurance mechanisms. And states have different types of approaches to that and different types of control that actually allow them to interfere in systems. And it's also the seemingly giving greater autonomy, institutional autonomy, often in different states to universities, but that always or almost always comes with ties, and it always seems to come with expectations for these universities to still align with state priorities, what they want to do both in teaching and in research. One important finding was also that we've seen in terms of system management and intervention that the legislation, the regulations that universities use across the different nations, they often look quite similar, and they often sound very similar. The directions are looking like going in the same direction. But then when you look at the everyday practices and when you try to understand that how it is implemented, this is when you can actually see the differences and how it works. And often, and I want to finish this section on that note, often it depends on how trust works within the given university system. And we've seen major differences in that. So at one end, for example, we've seen, for example, Norway and maybe Wales in the United Kingdom, where there is a very close relationship between the state administration and the universities. But this is a co-working relationship. They trust each other. They try to work together. They consult each other, and the sector, if they protest to something, quite often the government that takes that into consideration and reconsiders their actions. At the other end is Hungary, where is, for example, a very strong top-down approach. The sector is not consulted, is not trusted. The quality assurance systems that are put in place are extremely intrusive and more becoming state directed by creation of a buffer body, a quality assurance buffer body that is sitting within the Ministry of Education, and they are quite often overriding the decisions made by the quality assurance agency, for example, which is in principle staffed with academics. So these are just a few points to raise. There will be discussion, I'm pretty sure, about many of the others. Switching now to how students are now represented in universities, there were really interesting findings that only a few I can point to here. One of the findings was that across all nations, all countries, all universities, there is now a really strong formal representation of students almost at every level of the university. So they are included, and in principle they are listened to. They have a place and a voice where they can make their interest represented. However, the practice and doing the interviews with all these student unions and student representatives presented how many challenges they actually face. So formal representation in most cases doesn't mean actual power for them. And they were quite often complaining, for example, that universities play box ticking games and they create a mirage of shared governance, that they use, for example, politeness and talk of trust in many of these instances to actually disempower students instead of giving them power, and to sideline them towards issues that are not so important for the students, but much more important for universities. And the really important matters don't happen within the walls of the university. Of course, the findings also show across the board that many of the issues that students face and universities face are coming from external pressures. So the living expenses, the housing crisis, the fact that most students now in every single university we interview that have sometimes full-time jobs and they have to balance somehow these things together, it all impacts on the issues of how they can participate in governance and how they can participate in education. Another level in terms of student engagement was that it seems especially so in the continental European universities, that they are very well represented in department levels and at faculty levels and on boards that are related to teaching. And one of the things that matters for them was the quality of teaching and how they can participate in the kind of technologies that are used for teaching, meaning methods and the kind of pedagogies that are used. And in most cases, students that we interview felt that is the place where they actually have a voice and they are listened to and they can have some kind of power. So that's just a brief picture of that. And then in terms of the academic participation in university governance, when I started the interviewing process, I've been located in the UK and working in UK universities, and it's been strikes, and it's been protests, and it's been deterioration of the working conditions, and especially deterioration of the kind of power that academics felt they have over the governance processes within universities. So it was quite a huge surprise to me to start the interviewing in Europe and hear from academics across the board that they still felt that they had some kind of say in the way their universities are run and what kind of outcomes they can produce. And of course, there were caveats. They said that funding and research and the kind of research and quality of teaching and numbers and not keeping up with funding, not keeping up with the increase in student numbers. Of course, you've heard all the things that you've seen and heard in the UK as well. But actually, the fact was that they made a point of that. And that was one of the things that stayed with me, and I was trying to understand when we did the analysis of the data, that how comes, what's the reason for that? So why is that really major difference in perception? And one of the things that came out from the data was that there was a difference between the manager academics and the academics who do management tasks. And there is a difference in that respect between, at one end, the UK, where, of course, you always had vice chancellors coming into universities for a long time from external candidates. But now it's more and more departments, even so at the level of departments, that even the department head is not coming from the academic community, but quite often they are brought in externally. And there are reasons and arguments that why is that good. But then what we've seen that in contrast to that, for example, in continental Europe, although some of these trends started to take root, and many of the continental universities bring in, for example, deans from external places or rectors from external candidates, it's still quite a big tradition that department heads and faculty boards and sometimes faculty heads as well are coming from the academic community. And the fact that you work with your colleagues, that you then go back to that community, someone else comes after you, also from that community, seem to make a major difference in the way they actually dealt with change, both radical change and incremental change. And that changed also the feelings people had who worked with these within these departments. Then another interesting issue that came up, and then I will stop here, was the issues related to the governance of teaching. What kind of implications that had for academic participation. And as I mentioned earlier, there were all kinds of quality assurance processes in place across the countries. They were different. So for example, in Norway or in Germany, universities can accredit their own programs. They can decide what exactly they want to do within a course, within a department. They can restructure even major things, and there is no direct interference by quality assurance. In some countries like in Hungary and Portugal, it's much more direct intervention. So even for small changes, you sometimes have to first go through all the levels within the university, and then the university, if they decide that, okay, it's reasonable to do these changes, then they go to the quality assurance agency, and then they approve or not the changes. So there are varieties across that, but actually what academics said, and again, less in the UK, but very much in continental Europe, was that what they feel that they still have control of their classrooms. So they can decide what kind of readings, what kind of pedagogies they use, how they do that, what kind of worldviews they share with their students. And because of that is partly that they still enjoy so much the kind of work that they do. And this is why it's a lot of satisfaction for them, the teaching. I stop here, and then if there are questions, I'm pretty sure that we can pick up on many of the topics. Jürgen.
No, thank you, Aniko. And I neglected to introduce you because of the handover was so rapid. Let me say that Aniko is, I think, assistant professor in the Department of Organisation Sciences at the Free University. She was formerly a postdoc attached to this project, working at UCL in the UK. She did her doctorate at the Central European University in Budapest, which I think has been an important part of her own academic formation. She is one of two people on this project who really has a bicultural or tri-country origin, perhaps 4 countries in your case. The other, of course, is Jürgen Enders. Now, Jürgen has spent 10 years in Germany, 10 years in the Netherlands, and now 10 years in the UK. So he's gradually moving westward. The next step could be Ireland, After that, who knows? Jürgen is a professor at the School of Management at the University of Bath, where he pursues a research program, despite the fact that he's in the School of Management, related to higher education. His academic interest is focused on the study of institutional change in the field of universities and their role in society and the economy. He's a distinguished published academic author in this field, and I recommend that you have a look at his Google Scholar listing to get access to his career-long succession of important, careful, convincing studies of higher education. Jürgen.
Thank you very much. Sorry? I can do it. Is that work? Yeah, it works. Okay. Thank you very much to Anniko, to the department. Obviously, I can do higher education studies even in a management school, because there are people from public administration, from organization studies, we even have people from political science, from anthropology. Business schools can be the home for scholars from very different disciplinary backgrounds that find a place there. Mike asked me to contribute a chapter to the book that is more kind of taking at least one, if not two steps back from our data, from the empirical findings, that is supposed to be more of a reflection on the idea and role of the university in Europe and what our study might eventually tell us about it. So, and I just picked a few things from that chapter in the book. And I thought I start with this paradox, that at least I would argue the best way to characterize modern universities is to say, may you live in interesting times. While at the same time, higher education as a field, universities as a form of organizations, is a major success story. And I fear that being such a success story contributes to what I try to call here the demystification of the traditional idea and role of the university. It made me kind of think all the way back to Max Weber, to modernity having a tendency to demystify things, to move them into more profane grounds, if you like. And I think that is part of what we observe in our study as a kind of more long-term development in the background. Both, the apparent success story of higher education and research, of course, while at the same time, this kind of demystification, losing some of the specific characteristics that we traditionally would kind of affiliate with higher education as a field, with the university as an organizational form. And this certainly goes together, and I think this is kind of true across the board, even though with different timing, different strengths, in all the countries we looked at, that is a tendency to move from an understanding of the university as a cultural institution into an understanding of the university as a more utilitarian organization. And institution and organization are two very different things. And universities tended to be institutionalized organizations. To what extent this is the case still, I think is debatable. So this was kind of part of what I saw as a more common trend, if you like. And the last point I was trying to make here is, like many other studies I have done before, for example, also with Eva Blakely and Benedetto Lepori, with German and Dutch colleagues, they all prone to what some people would have called methodological nationalism. And I think I would still defend that actually, methodological nationalism in the study of higher education. At the same time, I think one of the elements I just wanted to stress here, if we want to understand organizational behavior in the field, meanwhile, it's clear we also have to look beyond the nation state. Anniko and Mike have been writing about the region in the sense of the, more. I think there's still a European element that we, in our context, need to take into account, even within Britain, even within England. And there is, of course, something like a global element, and different types of universities, different beasts of universities act on in different arenas. They're not just part of one organizational field, I would say, but they are part of several organizational fields. And these kind of field dynamics, I think, are important to understand, to start to approach the why and how question. And I could say more about that, but I leave it like that for now. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Jürgen, and thank you all three.
Well,
oh, okay. Thank you, Anniko.
Well, I hope we don't get another musical interlude in what I'm going to say, because I'm going to try and sum up what the book is saying about convergence and divergence. We didn't start out our research thinking about this topic. My expectations were that the impact of the Bologna process and the widespread application of new public management ideas would create a greater unity between European higher education systems. But in practice, the reorganization of the management of state systems seems simply to have created the conditions where state interventions can increase. Rather than greater diversity deriving from greater institutional autonomy, divergence has resulted from a greater state intervention in system management. In the UK, which in the past has sharply distinguished itself from continental European models, has actually moved closer to them by abolishing the intermediary buffer bodies, the University Grants Committee, and its successor, the Higher Education Funding Council, which had stood between the universities and the state, and thus it has opened the system to much greater state direction, is exercised through a regulator, the Office for Students. The direction towards a convergence of systems, which has been a dominant theme since the Lisbon Declaration in 2000 and has been nurtured by the EU Commission through a stream of communications, has in fact been disrupted by the increasing extent to which higher education has been subject to national policy interventions. Let me give some examples that we give in the book. In Hungary, where the state appears to have made better financial management and academic entrepreneurialism the centerpiece of its policy towards universities, it's imposed on universities 5-man governing bodies drawn from Fidesz, the dominant political party, and has inserted powerful non-academic officials, the chancellors, to control universities' expenditure with authority to countermand the rector and the academic senates. In the UK, the government has encouraged boards of external lay governors to act like company boards, the business model, with vice-chancellors acting as chief executives and the Senate's toothless, except in some research universities. Meanwhile, in Germany, lay governors have been introduced in line with an EU-sponsored modernization campaign, but they don't necessarily form a majority on the board. There are variations between Länder, but German university senates appear not to have lost any of their powers. In Norway, however, where relations between universities and the state are highly consensual, they've got rid of senates altogether and rely on governing boards which have academic majorities. Another strategic example is the way states have addressed the issues around expansion and non-university status. Here, systems are profoundly influenced by national interest and tradition. On the one hand, you have Norway, activated by a strong sense of providing equal opportunity of access to higher education to people in hinterland areas, creating a structure where colleges can voluntarily engage in extensive mergers to achieve university status. On the other, you have Germany, where there has been a strict adherence to a binary division of institutions, which has resulted in 74% of the student population being located in the universities, and where the Fachhochschulen have been restricted to master's degrees only. Only now are some Fachhochschulen being empowered to award doctorates, and the assumption of the title of Universities of Applied Science has only been legitimated for international usage. Other variants are Portugal, where legislation is being passed to permit polytechnics to call themselves polytechnic universities, and Ireland, where mergers of former institutes of technology, which were not research active, are now becoming technological universities. Some divergence can also be found in research. In England, where non-university institutions have been upgraded to full universities, many are described and informally treated as teaching-only universities. But in Scotland, all upgraded institutions are required to be research active. In Norway, the merged regional colleges must obtain approval from the quality agency NOKUT for 4 PhD programs and 5 masters to qualify for the award of a university title. Most strikingly, Portugal has chosen to concentrate its research into multi-university polytechnic research centres, geographically separate from the institutions from which the staff are drawn. Both Germany and France have initiated internal competitive processes paralleling the UK's research assessment exercise in efforts to strengthen research and improve their international rankings. National systems seem to be driving increased diversity. This is not to say that convergence has been wholly reversed. Indeed, convergence and divergence can occur simultaneously. In all the higher education systems we research, we found that institutional management was being strengthened in the reinforcement of the powers of rectors, the replacement of appointed rather than elected senior university officers, and in the introduction of lay involvement in governance. But the forms of these changes can differ widely between countries. In research, the investment in Horizon marks a considerable advance in establishing cross-European machinery, but the drive for system change comes from the individual governments. The EU has become more centripetal in areas like finance, health, defence, and policy towards national borders, but it doesn't have competence in education. The spirit of Bologna seems to be in retreat, and it seems that national priorities are driving higher education systems further apart. This could have important consequences for the fragmentation of European higher education away from the former ambition for greater unification. Are we entering a new phase of differentiation? We look forward to hearing your views. Thank you.
That was